Hello everyone and welcome to my tier list for patch 6.0 and the new season 16. We've had about 5 days now on the new patch, so we have a rough understanding of what the meta looks like and what the meta can look like in the near future as well. With the durability patch coming in, new items, item changes, and a whole new map. There's so many things to talk about in this video, and as always I'm going to be going through every single role, talking about champions, whether they benefited or not from the durability update and some of the item changes. If you enjoy the content on this channel, make sure you leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's get into the video. So first off, in the Baron lane, I think there's only one queen right now in the Baron lane, which is Camille. I think that she is by far the strongest Baron lane champion right now. Everyone got a bit tankier from the durability patch, which means that Camille's true damage on her first ability is going to be much more beneficial than it was before. She also has sustain with fleet footwork, and also her second ability. She has lockdown with her ultimate. Camille just has a all-round general great kit that makes her really nice to play during the laning phase. You can even get ahead during the laning phase if you find the right opportunities. Also, a passive shield helps her out a lot during the laning phase. And then when it comes to team fights, there's no one really better than Camille in a team fight. You jump in on the back line, you use your ultimate on one of their carries, and they're isolated. Everyone is pushed away, and then Camille can really make a difference in trying to do as much damage to the enemy carry as possible. But below that, there are still quite a few S tier champions that I feel like are very strong. As you can tell, there are a lot of tanks in the S tier. Tanks definitely got a huge buff overall with the durability patch, making them more tankier, and also just allowing them to do a lot more in team fights and also during the laning phase as well. You have champions like Set, who still builds like a tank. You still go for Grasp the Undying. Remember, Grasp the Undying has now changed, so now it only scales with your health instead of scaling with also your attack damage and your ability power. So that's why you're going to see these bruisers not build Grasp the Undying before. In the previous patch, Jax would build Grasp the Undying top, Wukong would, Camille would. There's probably a way that you can still make it work with Grasp, but you're just not going to deal as much damage anymore because it doesn't scale with your extra AD and ability power that you're building in the lane. But as I mentioned, Set still builds tanky, still builds Heartsteel. Heartsteel with Grasp the Undying is one of the strongest combos right now because you just gain so much extra health and you could do so much damage with Heartsteel and also Titanic Hydra on top of that. So Set is a great option. Ornn, of course, very good tank with all the crowd control that he offers. Laning phase also very good, being able to build items from outer base, nothing wrong with that. Mundo is maybe a bit more situational. I've moved Mundo up from A tier to S tier, but he is more of a situational tank where he does a lot better against a lot of AP champions rather than AD champions. Since he has so much healing in his kit, he's very difficult to burst down. And when these mages and these AP champions use all their burst damage, Mundo could just heal it back up whilst the enemies have cooldowns. So overall, pretty good against the AP champions. Still good against AD champions as well. The only downside about Dr. Mundo is his early game is a bit weaker than other tanks, but still very good. Shen, in general, shields have a lot more value now because of the durability patch. Shields are a lot more difficult to try and break down because everyone has more armor, everyone has more magic resist. Shen as a split push is just very annoying. You can join in with your ultimate into a fight. You already have your second ability which can block attacks, and you're still very tanky and you can still do a lot of damage. Maokai, really good again, still in the Baron lane, still probably his strongest role in this patch. Jungle, he's still okay, support, he's still okay, but top lane, he's still very good. Has a lot of sustain during the laning phase, and again, when he joins team fight, his ultimate is great. And Malphite might be the best tank in the meta right now. I've been playing quite a lot of Malphite when I get filled in the Baron lane. Most of the time, you're at least going to be playing against two, I would say, AD champions. Very rarely that you see a case where there is multiple AP champions, which is why I say Dr. Mundo is a bit more of a situational tank. But when you're playing Malphite now, he scales so much with his extra armor. You have to remember that Malphite got buffed a few times in the past, you know, in a few previous patches. So he's been buffed in terms of his damage. He's been buffed in terms of his tankiness now with the durability patch. So in general, he's a very strong tank to play. He's also very easy to play as well. He doesn't really have a lot of skill. All you have to do is just use your ultimate on the backline, tank a bunch of damage. The new Randuin's Omen also helps him out a bunch as well to try and reduce some of the critical strike damage that he might be taking. So that's everything in terms of tanks. Rumble, the new champion. Some of you might be surprised to see Rumble in the S tier, but I think he's super underrated. I think the Rumble is a very, very strong champion. He does a crazy amount of damage in the early game. He's one of the biggest lane bullies in the game. He can get such a big advantage during the early game. The problem is that obviously people on Wild Rift have not played League of Legends before, so they actually don't understand how some of these new champions works, which is why I bring out these guides at the start of every single new champion, so then people can have a rough understanding and a beginner setup for champions like Rumble. It's all about his heat management. It's all about knowing how much heat you need to be able to enhance your next ability. It's all about knowing when to go into overheat mode to get the huge amount of damage with your auto attacks, with the huge amount of burst of attack speed that you get. In general, Rumble is very, very strong. I actually have a Rumble video coming up very soon when I tested out First Strike Rumble, and I was farming gold with First Strike Rumble, and I went this like full AP burst build. Definitely a very fun one, so you have to stay tuned to that one. Singed got a bit of a nerf in this patch. Base magic resist going down. The third ability can now be interrupted by things like knockups and knockbacks and everything, and also the cast speed has been reduced ever so slightly, but then he gets some of the cooldown back. I still think Singed is very good. I still think the champion still offers a lot in terms of just the third ability itself. The third ability still being ranged is the most broken part about his kit. Of course, everyone got tankier, so Singed is just a lot easier to play now during the laning phase. You're not getting punished as much during the laning phase. So Singed overall, still a very good champion. I have moved him down from S+ tier to S tier, but I still think he's very strong and you can still give him a try. Warwick's still very good in the Baron lane as well, even though he has been nerfed quite a few times. Warwick's still a very, very strong champion that you can still pick up, you can still play and still perform extremely well on. Darius as well. Darius is just absolutely crazy. His bleed effect, these longer team fights benefit Darius so much because he can stack up his bleed more often. He can try and get his ultimate and his execute, which is what Darius wants. Darius wants these longer team fights to try and get into a state of the game where he can actually be beneficial. Mordekaiser is still pretty good as well. He has been nerfed a few times, but he's still a very good AP option in the Baron lane. I would say Rumble is probably a better option in the AP Baron lane now than Mordekaiser, but it's still an option to have some AP damage if you need it in the Baron lane. Wukong's still very good at team fights, very good in laning phase as well. Your first ability that still does quite a bit of damage, and you can use this to poke early on. Then you have Jax for the late game scaling, with his counter strike, with all his AP damage that he's dealing, with his auto attacks on top of that is still very good. And then Aatrox as well. An item that's pretty underrated probably right now is Eclipse, because Eclipse does damage based on the enemy's health, which obviously now everyone has more health, so Eclipse gets more benefits. So that's why Aatrox stays in the S tier. If I look over here, I got the notes of my changes so I don't lose track of what changes I've made and everything like that as well. So if I look over to the screen, that is why, just to make sure that I don't miss out on anything. A-tier champions are still okay. I think people have to remember that A-tier champions are still good champions to play. I would class like B and C tier champions as champions that you should avoid. I just think there is a little bit of a gap between the S tier and the A-tier champions, but all the champions in A tier and every single one of these tiers are still completely fine to play. A couple of champions I've moved down. Renekton kind of struggles a little bit, to be fair. Now, I mean, everyone getting tankier in the early game means that Renekton struggles a little bit to try and get the early game lead. Of course, he's a bit tankier himself as well, but his damage output is just not that great at the moment, to be fair. They haven't buffed his damage. The durability patch comes in. He was winning lanes before, but now I feel like he just struggles to win lane phase in general. And Akali I've moved down. I mean, assassins in general have gotten weaker. Assassins are still at a state where they can still one-shot you. They just need more resources now to one-shot you. You could say that there's maybe not a big difference between before the durability patch and after the durability patch. I definitely feel a difference with assassins in general. I feel like I'm not taking as much damage as what I did before. Maybe that's just me looking at it wrong in a case. But in general, assassins need more resources now. They need more items. They need to get a lead to actually become useful. Because if they don't have the early lead, if they don't get early kills, and if they don't get, 2 or 3 items under their belt, then they're definitely going to struggle. So in general, assassins have moved down. Teemo with a bit of a buff stays in A tier for now. I still think Teemo is pretty annoying to play against, to be fair. You know, we talk about these AP champions that are an alternative if you need some AP damage sources in the Baron lane. Teemo's actually a pretty damn good choice as well. The passive got buff, I believe, if I'm not wrong, so you get more poison per auto attack that you do with Teemo now, so a little bit more damage. Just annoying champion to deal with. I think the only downside with Teemo is that you're just very useless in team fights. You don't really do anything. You just stand there, auto attack, use your blind, and then you just hope that the enemies walk over mushrooms and you deal damage to them. You don't have any crowd control. You don't have any use in a team fight at all. And with the game definitely going for more team fight based, with, you know, team fights lasting longer as well, and also with tanks being very strong in this meta, yeah, I'm not too sure about Teemo. Sion still pretty good tank. I just don't think he's as strong of a tank as the ones in the S tier. Still could be very good though. He does have more damage now in the early game, but I still think he struggles to win most of the laning phases anyway. Yone, pretty decent in the Baron lane. You can still trade and still do pretty well in the Baron lane with Yone. Obviously, he has been nerfed quite a few times now in the past few months, so he's definitely not as strong as what he was before. Fiora, you can try and use Eclipse on a Fiora. I've been seeing that Eclipse is actually very, very popular on Fiora recently. I've been seeing a lot of people run it, and since you can proc Eclipse very, very quickly with your third ability, your first ability, and your auto attack, you can get that quick shield and do the extra bonus damage. So maybe I have to give that a try, but in general, you know, Fiora's in a decent spot. Yasuo, obviously not as strong in the Baron lane as what he is in the mid lane. You can still go for the tank Yasuo build. I've been seeing people build Heartsteel now on Yasuo, since your Grasping Undying now scales more with your health. So instead of going for items like Wit's End into Divine Sunderer, you just go Heartsteel into Wit's End into Divine Sunderer. So you have that stacking HP, so you could just be more of a tank with Yasuo. But in general, Yasuo struggles a bit in the Baron lane. Has a much easier time in the mid lane though, since he can just build Wit's End and cancel out all the AP damage. Volibear's still pretty good as a tank. You still want to build Grasp on him because he's still going for a tank build anyway. Still very strong champion to play. Gwen's in a bit of a weird spot. I don't really know. I don't really know if Gwen is really good or bad, to be fair. I mean, I don't think I've seen a Gwen a single time in any of my games yet. I've played over like 50 games already. I've not seen a single Gwen. So I don't think Gwen's that great, to be fair, anyway, in general. I just think that she's kind of struggles to scale. She just doesn't really do too much, to be fair. Yeah, I'm not really too sure what to think about Gwen. I think she's decent. That's why she's in A tier. She's not like B tier or something, but I don't think she's like crazy good. Kayle in A tier. Now, the crazy thing about the durability patch is it actually benefits Kayle more than you think. The early game is one of the most difficult parts about Kayle, with her, you know, with her damage in general, and also just her tankiness and her survivability. Now with the durability patch coming in, with everyone getting more health, everyone getting more armor, more mag resist, Kayle can actually survive a lot easier now during the laning phase. And that means that you can walk up, you can farm a few minions, and then you'll be able to get a few items to scale and get to level 13 as soon as possible. And then of course, when you hit level 13, that's when Kayle shines, and that's when Kayle becomes very, very powerful. Kennen got a bit of a buff, again stays in A tier, still a good champion to play as an AP damage source in the Baron lane. Obviously with team fights becoming such a big thing now, Kennen's ultimate can be very, very powerful, but in general still stays in A tier. Jace, still pretty decent. You do a lot of poke damage. You're a very, very big lane bully, very difficult to deal with, still very strong. Again, you can run things like Eclipse on Jace because you can proc it very, very quickly, which is going to be quite a nice benefit. Urgot, decent, not too bad. I mean, I think with Urgot, the only downside is that you really struggle with your engages. You can be kited very, very easily by AD carries, by mages now, which are very, very popular at the moment. So he definitely can struggle, but he still does a lot of damage and he can still be very, very tanky. Riven has a lot of mobility, still very powerful this patch. A lot better in the jungle than in Baron lane, because that mobility helps you a lot when farming around the jungle and when rotating around the map. Whereas in the Baron lane, you're kind of stuck there for quite some time. Garen, I believe I've also moved down, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember if... Actually, no, Garen might have already been 8 tier. But yeah, Garen, even though he's the easy champion to play, again, one of them champions that kind of struggles because he gets kited very easily, but still a good champion to play. And then Olaf as well. Olaf has been pretty annoying for quite some time now, to be fair. I mean, the ultimate, with him being able to just be invulnerable to any sort of crowd control, him running towards you can be very difficult when you're playing mages and AD carries, but again, still in a decent spot. And then the B tier are just champions that I just don't think are very strong right now in the Baron lane. I think that there are stronger champions than, you know, champions that are in the B tier right now. Obviously, Ambessa is one of the best junglers in the game. The problem is Ambessa struggles in the early levels and you can't really trade that much in the Baron lane, so that's why she's sitting all the way down the B tier. Vladimir just struggles to scale and just doesn't really do that much damage. Nasus obviously needs a farm from his first ability. If you can farm with your first ability and join fights, then great, but the problem is you probably have to farm and scale more with Nasus than what you have to do with Kayle now. I feel like they need to change Nasus in terms of what he gets with his first ability stacking, because his damage is just not there right now. Irelia, obviously, of course, very difficult champion to play, very difficult champion to master. Isn't as strong in the Baron lane at the moment, unfortunately. Pantheon just doesn't do enough damage, and Trendem is just the same in terms of scaling as well. So, yeah, that's everything with the Baron lane. Moving into the jungle, I don't think anyone would be surprised to see a Mumu in the S+ tier. The buff that a Mumu got was so unneeded, so unneeded. The crazy thing is that a Mumu was already strong in the last patch. You add in the durability patch, which buffs tanks like a Mumu, for example, and then you also give him a buff on top of that, which you do more of the percentage, more of the target's maximum health as percent damage on your second ability. That got buffed, and then you get more tankiness with your third ability. So now you get more bonus armor and more bonus magic resist depending on the items that you build, which if they're tank items, then you get more value from your third ability. So they made a Mumu do more damage to champions that have more health, which is great with the durability patch. More tankiness on top of the durability patch is just, yeah. Again, no surprise. I don't know what Riot are thinking, but yeah, no one should be surprised that Mumu's in the S+ tier right now. The champion does way too much base damage from what he's building as a tank. He's also very tanky. He doesn't take a lot of damage. He has one of the best teamfight ultimates in the game that can win your fight. Very strong champion. As I mentioned briefly, Ambessa, very strong in the jungle. Her mobility and her catch potential with her ultimate just make her very powerful in general. You can run around, you can roam around as a jungler. You can get your resets when you get a kill as well, which, like I said, in general, Ambessa, very strong jungler. And Echo's still up here as well. One of the, I guess, last surviving assassins, you could say, in this meta. And the reason why Echo is still up here is really he's more of a sustained assassin, if you think about it. He still does a lot of burst damage when he jumps in, especially with his passive, and he has a huge AoE stun with his second ability, but also he can get out of fights. He has that ease of access of getting out of fights with his ultimate, which is what a lot of assassins don't really have. The problem with assassins is that when you jump in, you don't have a way to jump back out. You're just an all-in champion, and you just pray that you one-shot someone before they kill you. And if you trade the AD carry for yourself, then you take that as a win. Echo can jump in, kill a champion, and then jump straight back out again with the ultimate. And you still have the shield as well with your second ability. So there is so much that Echo has that other assassins don't. And with obviously fleet footwork still being very powerful, you could proc your passive much quicker and just run around during team fights and be an absolute nuisance. So in general, Echo is very strong. That's why he still sits in the S+ tier. Just seeing if I changed anything else. Oh yes, Diana moved down. Obviously Diana got hit with a pretty huge nerf in this patch. That's why Diana has moved down. I still think Diana is pretty good. I really love her new ultimate, that she can flash, use other abilities, and she's not just standing in one place whilst charging her ultimate. So I still think that benefits Diana a lot, but her jungle clear speed definitely got hit quite a lot with the nerf, and also her burst damage isn't as high as before. Zed actually moves up from S tier, which is probably one of the assassins that actually moves up a tier. I think Zed in general, if you're going for this bruiser style build now, if you're going for items like Black Cleaver, Trinity Force, which are already very strong items, the buff that Zed got with his energy, not in patch 6.0 but a patch before that, he now doesn't use as much energy with his abilities, which means he can cycle more of his abilities and do a lot more burst damage, which is great. And also he has a way to escape after he jumps in as well at the same time. Again, something that normally Echo has, but Zed also has the same thing. When you jump with the ultimate, you can use the ultimate to jump back to the shadow. But in general, the Zed buff was very, very nice. Again, his bruiser build is very strong right now because there's a lot of bruisers in the game and there's a lot of tanks in the game, which is why items like Black Cleaver and Trinity Force work so well. Dyna is there as well. Rengar as well as an assassin, still very powerful. His invisibility, I should say, more than anything, is what makes him so powerful and what makes him so strong. He can run around with his invisibility. He can still do a lot of damage, and he can still escape with the movement speed with his second ability, and he can still stop a lot of crowd control coming his way. In general, Rengar is still a very good assassin jungler if you want to play assassin junglers. But as you can tell, pretty much most of the S tier is dominated by tanks or bruisers. Well, mainly bruisers and some tanks in there as well, but mainly bruisers fitting in here. Obviously, Vi with her lockdown, still very, very powerful. She still does a crazy amount of base damage. Her ultimate is one of the best in the game. Riven, as I mentioned in the barrel lane, has a lot of mobility in the jungle and can really use that to advantage when ganking lanes and also roaming around the jungle to farm as much as possible. Jarvan, I've been playing quite a lot recently. I think Jarvan is, not gonna lie, hidden OP, to be fair. I think this champion does a crazy amount of damage. He's super tanky. His ultimate is very, very powerful. If you can time the flashes that get used on the enemy team, and if you engage on champions that don't have flash, they have no way to escape. And obviously, you need to make sure they don't have dashes as well to escape from your ultimate. But there are some scenarios where Jarvan becomes a very, very strong champion and honestly very, very difficult to deal with. And he also does a lot of damage as well at the same time. Hecarim just a big nuisance, especially with phase rush. You can just run around during team fights, do a bunch of sustained damage. You do have your ultimate as well, which is still very impactful during team fights with the fear mechanic. Yeah, in general, Hecarim does quite a lot of damage. Lilia, I'm probably going to change out Electrocute for phase rush because now Lilia is probably going to be going into what Lilia should have been in the first place. I kept Lilia with Electrocute because it was what was strong in the last patch. This burst damage Lilia build was very, very powerful, but now with champions being a bit more tankier, you can use phase rush more often. You can run around team fights more often. You're a bit tankier as well, but then you do just a lot more sustained damage with items like Liandry's and Riftmaker. So I'll probably change that rune eventually, but yeah, Lilia still very powerful. Xin Zhao also still very good as well. Still does a lot of damage. Still has a very strong ultimate, especially against ranged champions. If you're against multiple ranged champions, then Xin Zhao is a very, very strong pick to go, because if they try and hit you outside of your ultimate, they're not going to deal any damage. Rammus, I was very tempted to move up into the S+ tier. Rammus, of course, got a buff before the durability patch. The durability patch has made him even stronger. The only thing is that you need to play Rammus when you're against multiple AD champions. If you're against multiple AP champions, then Rammus definitely will probably struggle. He's still going to struggle in terms of, you know, he can't build armor, which most of his damage scales off armor. He still could be a very good tank. You can still build items like the new Kenya Rukun. You still build Force and Nature, which is two very strong tank items. But in general, you want to build Rammus against AD champions. You can benefit from some of these armor items. Sorry. You can also go Yordle Trap on him as well. Salty, for those of you who don't know, is a Rammus main who I duel with sometimes. He's been going for the Yordle Trap on Rammus and actually been farming quite a lot of gold because the Taunt works as a displacement, which is very, very nice. Wukong jungle still works very well. You still have, again, that teamfight potential. As I mentioned in the Baron lane, you still clear through jungle pretty quickly. Pretty nice. Shyvana, since the early game now is, in my opinion, a little bit slower. It allows Shyvana to farm through the jungle camps, get some objectives, and get some stacks a bit earlier on in the game. The downside with Shyvana is that she's not very strong when it comes to ganks until she gets her ultimate. And even when she gets her ultimate, at times you still need to be very difficult because you don't have any crowd control. So you need to be ganking lanes that already have crowd control and already have setup potential, so you can jump in with your ultimate and do the damage that your team needs. Again, since the early game is a little bit slower, it allows Shyvana to scale and become a mid and late game beast, to be fair, with the items that you can build. Warwick's still very powerful. I think he's stronger probably in the Baron lane than in the jungle, but he's still a very strong jungler, especially with your ultimate. Even if you miss the first part of your ultimate, you can still auto attack and still do a lot of damage afterwards. And Olaf jungle, as I mentioned in the Baron lane, your ultimate being able to stop crowd control is really, really good at just running onto the back line, doing as much damage as possible, and being a very annoying bruiser. Moving on down to the A tier. I'm not too sure if I changed anything here. Oh yeah, I just moved one champion down, which was Lee Sin. Before this patch, Lee Sin got a buff, which moved him back up to S tier, but I've moved it back down to A tier because of the durability patch in general. And I think Lee Sin just sits well in the A tier because he's a strong champion, don't get me wrong. Like, he's a very strong champion. He has a lot of carry potential. The problem is the difficulty, that high skill ceiling that you have, which for new players coming into the game, if you want to pick up a champion, someone like Amumu, for example, is such a better champion than Lee Sin. Like, so much easier to play. A tank that basically takes no damage, still does a lot of damage at the same time. Lee Sin has that playmaker potential with his kit, but he takes a lot of time to master and to get to that point where you feel comfortable playing Lee Sin. So that's why I moved Lee Sin back down. But again, in general, A-tier champions still pretty decent. You have champions like Nunu, which can still be very strong as a tank. Kindred as a carry can also be very good, but you really need frontline if you are playing Kindred. If you don't have any frontline at all, then Kindred can be very difficult. Master Yi, of course, with the scaling that can happen. If you can get a few kills in the early game, you can scale and be very strong later on. Fiddlesticks is also very powerful with his ultimate, can still be powerful during team fights. Graze is still pretty decent. I see people build fleet footwork on Graze. I don't really understand it personally because, I mean, yes, you get 2 auto attacks in quick succession, but it doesn't actually increase your attack speed by that much. Like, your auto attacks don't become that much faster, so that's why Conqueror is still there. Honestly, I think I much prefer Rust Kayn than Shadow Assassin Kayn this patch because of the crowd control and the extra tankiness that you can get from Rust Kayn, and also the healing as well can also be very powerful. But both Kayns at the moment are still sitting in A tier. They're still very good depending on the situation of the game. Viego still can be very powerful. I've seen Viego's definitely carry a lot of games. There's been games where Viego has gone Trinity Force into Blade Rune King have been powerful. And there's games where people have gone Collector into Solari Charge Blade and it's still been powerful. I think in general, Viego just has a kit that no one else can match. And I think that's the really big problem with Viego and why he's still strong in this meta. Even after so many nerfs to his crit scaling, to his items, to his damage in general, he still has a kit that no one else can compare with. And that's why he's still so powerful, you know, with the mobility with his ultimate, for example. Volibear's still a pretty good jungler. Maybe not as strong as what he was last patch, but still very good. But in my opinion, stronger in the Baron lane. Yone can still farm quite easily and get into a state of the game where he can jump in. The great thing about Yone is that he can gank from somewhere that other people can't, with his third ability, you know, jumping over walls and using that as a surprise factor with your ultimate can be very, very powerful. Kayle in general is low-key a pretty good jungler as well. Again, with the early game being slower, kind of the same with Shyvana. With the early game being slower for Kayle, it means that she can farm a little bit more in the early game and she can get to a state of the game. Again, level 13 is your real power spike. You get to level 13, you get to a point in the game where you're very, very powerful, that you don't need to farm jungle camps anymore. And of course, Kayle jungle, it means that you defeat the purpose of what Kayle is weak at anyway, which is the early game. If you're playing in the jungle, hey, you can clear through the jungle without any problems at all, unless you get invaded, which very rarely happens in Wild Rift. Pantheon can still be very, very good. Again, his ultimate is very good for ganking, and he still can do a lot of burst damage, but again, burst damage in general is just much weaker. Whoops, I accidentally clicked on that by accident. Whoops, let me go back to here. Where was I? Yeah, Pantheon, just in general, much weaker than not much weaker, but weaker than what he was last patch, but still pretty good. Morgana's still pretty good as well. I think Morgana's Black Shield has a lot more value in general now, since there's still so much crowd control in the game. Morgana is still like this sustained mage that just uses her second ability and tries to do as much damage as possible. Aatrox still pretty decent as well. You can still have a lot of damage potential, a lot of carry potential with Aatrox in the jungle. Again, you can kind of farm up, get to level 5, use your ultimate for your extra movement speed, and use the knockups to try and gank as much as possible Gragas still really good as well. Again, doesn't do as much damage as what he did in the previous patch, but he's still very good with his ultimate, especially the displacement of his ultimate, being able to knock enemies back into your team. And you can follow up that with a body slam, your auto attack, and also your first ability. In general, Gragas still does a lot of damage, and also he's still very good as a jungler. Nautilus as well, if you do want to play the AP version of Nautilus in the jungle, you still can. You have the lockdown with your ultimate, which a lot of enemies cannot dodge, unless you're playing things like Cleanse now, which can stop knockups, or unless you're playing against Morgana that has Black Shield. Not really a lot of ways that people can stop Nautilus ultimate coming in, and you can follow up with your damage afterwards and your crowd control. Lee Sin I already mentioned. And Tryndamere in general is, again, the kind of same as Kayle and Shyvana, where you can farm up a little bit during the early game. You don't have to suffer a lot in the early game, and you can scale and you can be very, very annoying later on in the game. B tier champions, I mean, in general, these champions can still work. They're still viable, but I think they're definitely a lot weaker. I mean, assassins in general, I've moved down to the B tier. Evelyn's been in B tier for quite some time anyway, but she, again, gets much weaker. I played against an Evelyn, I think it was yesterday or the day before, trying to jump on me as a Victor. I took barrier because I knew I was against an Evelyn. The first ability on Victor plus the barrier saved me from a full damage combo of Evelyn. And this wasn't like me being really far ahead in levels and Evelyn being really behind. This was like level 5 or level 6 or whatever it was. And I survived the full damage Evelyn combo because of my first ability shield and barrier on top of that, which just kind of shows that shields in general are a lot more powerful, and, you know, assassins becoming much weaker. Kha'Zix I moved down, and also Talon I moved down. I think Talon is probably the only one that I feel like can maybe do very well and can still be a very strong assassin because of his invisibility. Even Kha'Zix as well. I mean, assassins in general can still work, but I just think they're a lot more difficult to pull off than last patch, which is why they moved down a tier. Other champions in this tier, obviously Maokai in the jungle, not as powerful as what he was before, but still viable option if you want to go that way. Neela, if you're playing duo or trio queue, and if your other duo trio queue has enchanters and, you know, they can buff you up, great. It's fantastic. Camille as a bruiser is still pretty decent. Fiora, Darius, Jason, Gwen, these are more like unique junglers, which can still work, but they're just not as powerful as actual junglers in the tiers above. Moving on to the mid lane as I get rid of this. Moving on to the mid lane. Mid lane's pretty difficult to actually think of who deserves to be in the S+ tier. I think Victor 100% deserves to be in the S+ tier. I'll probably change this electrocute to first strike, because first strike is actually pretty damn good now of Victor, because you get more base damage and more base gold from poking before. The problem with first strike before is that you wasn't really getting that much value from proccing first strike and using your third ability as poke for first strike, but it's actually pretty decent now. Obviously Syndra is a bit different because you can follow up your first strike with your stun and extra bonus damage on top of that, which deals true damage and gives you bonus gold. But Victor probably deals first strike now. But yeah, Victor, I think in my opinion, the strongest mage right now. As you can tell in the S+ tier and the S tier, mages in general are very, very powerful. Mages got base health buff, health per level buff, base armor, base MR, armor per level, and MR per level. Mages probably got the biggest buff out of every single role in the game. I mean, Marksman also got a pretty good buff, but the problem is Marksman didn't get base armor and base magic resist, but mages did. So every single mage is very, very viable right now. It doesn't matter what mage that you go with, every single mage is viable. Every single mage is going to be able to do a lot of damage. The great thing is you survive a lot more in the early game, and for late game scaling mages like Victor and Syndra that want to get stacks towards their passive, that want to upgrade their abilities, both of these champions benefited the most, which is why these two are in S+ tier for now. But in my opinion, all these S tier champions have the potential to move up to S+ tier. I think that all these champions in their own right can be very, very powerful and very, very strong. But again, I just like the scaling that Syndra and Victor have with upgrading their abilities and just being very powerful in general. Moving down to the S tier, Ziggs, very safe mid laner to play. You can just use your abilities at range and do a bunch of damage, and you can just use your ultimate to just do a bunch of AoE damage in team fights as well. One of the safest mid lane champions to play. Lissandra still works very well as a mage. You still have your ultimate, which is one of the biggest ultimates in the game, whether you use it on yourself when you're jumping into 5 players, or using it on an enemy champion for lockdown to allow the rest of your teammates to follow up afterwards. Again, very, very powerful, still very strong. Zoe, really powerful right now. First strike, obviously a huge buff to Zoe, because you're dealing more true damage and you're getting more when you're getting more gold when you land your sleepy trouble bubble. But your first ability is going to do a huge amount of damage now with the first strike buff. And as I mentioned, laning phase becomes a lot easier with Zoe. You'll be able to farm up, you'll be able to get a few items, and in team fights, you can use your bubble to do a bunch of damage. Morgana's still a very easy mid lane champion to play. You basically, all you have to do is just use your second ability, clear the waves, try and roams, and try and be, a help for your team. But yeah, in general, Morgana, very easy and very strong. Galio still has a surprising amount of burst damage. Galio, again, is a bit more of a situational mid laner where you probably need to be against multiple AP damage sources and need to be against mages. And that's why Galio is in S tier, is that because mages have become more powerful, it means that Galio in general becomes more powerful because he has a magic shield on his second ability. He has that surprise factor with his engages, with his taunt, and he can still do a bit of burst damage. So that's why Galio still sits in S tier. But as I go through this, mages are just in general becoming much more stronger. Ari in general still has the charm, still has quite a lot of damage in general, has the mobility with the ultimate. Veigar has an easier time now with scaling and trying to get as much stacks towards his passive as possible to deal more AP damage. Orianna with her sustained damage in general and just a lot of damage with being able to use her abilities in team fights. Her very low cooldowns means that you can just build Archangel Staff. I was going to say Moral Mana, but that's the AD version. Archangel Staff, all you have to do is build that and build damage afterwards. Obviously, Orianna got buffed a while ago as well, so in general, Orianna is very powerful. Yasuo, as I mentioned, much stronger in the mid lane. I probably need to change this out of Lethal Tempo because you probably want to go Grassy Undying with mid lane Yasuo. This is more of like a damage build, but Grassy Undying is probably still better right now. Yeah, Yasuo in general, much more powerful in the mid lane because you'll be able to use your wall to your advantage against some of these mages that are trying to do damage to you. And of course, you'll put an items like Wit's End, which is a lot of magic resist. You can go for the magic resist boots, and you're basically unkillable with all your extra shielding. Heimerdinger still a very strong mage as well. You have your Taurus do a lot of damage. You have that huge AoE third ability with your bomb, which you can upgrade, which is very nice. Echo's still very good in the mid lane as well. You clear waves with Echo very quickly that you become this very powerful roam mage. Roam assassin, sorry, which as you can tell, Echo is the only assassin in this S tier because he has so much wave clear. He can clear waves, he can roam around the map, and he can make such a big difference. And again, he has that factor of jumping into fights, jumping out of fights, and having extra movement speed. And Kassadin in general as well. I moved Kassadin up, I believe. Yep, I moved Kassadin up from A tier to S tier. Again, the same thing with, Kassadin got the buff that all the other kind of mages got in a way. In general, Kassadin has a much easier early game now. He's never going to die. He's never going to be under any threat. Again, with mages becoming much more powerful, it means that Kassadin's magic shield again become powerful as well. If he still gets that. I'm trying to think now if he still gets that. I'm pretty sure he still gets a magic shield, right? Maybe I'm wrong. I haven't played Kassadin or against Kassadin for quite some time. Does he still get the magic shield? Anyway, without the magic shield question anyway, he's still a lot easier to play in the early game. He still can scale, and he's still very strong with all his mobility and all his damage. Again, A tier champions in general, a lot more powerful. Some assassins have moved down from S tier to A tier, and some champions have moved up from B tier to A tier. Aurelion Sol and Brand have moved up from B tier to A tier. As I mentioned, mages in general become a lot more powerful. The great thing now about Aurelion Sol is that he can farm his stacks much easier during the laning phase, and also he has that percent health damage build and also damage from his abilities, which with everyone getting tankier and tanks coming into the game, it means that Aurelion Sol is going to become more popular again. Again, with the shift in meta, you can tell by what champions are being picked and what champions can be very strong, which you'll see also in the AD carry section. And Brand as well, I still think he struggles because he doesn't have any escape mechanics, but he can still do a lot of damage, and he's still a great mage that, again, now you can survive a lot more in the early game because you have more tankiness. Assassins have moved down. Champions like Akali have moved down to A tier. Still very strong in the mid lane. Again, you have that survivability now in the mid lane against the mages, and you can try and burst and do quite a bit of damage, but Akali in general is still pretty good. I do think Zed is weaker in the mid lane compared to jungle. I think in jungle he just has a lot more ways to use his ultimate and proc first strike and gank and try and get an advantage, whereas in the mid lane you don't really have that same sort of outplay potential. But sticking with the rest of A tier, Twisted Fate still is very powerful as a mage. Again, got the mage buff with Zyra as well. Twisted Fate has the gold card, still uses ultimate to try and roam around the map. The amount of times I've seen Twisted Fates not use their ultimate to roam and to try and get an advantage around the map is just so annoying. But yeah, in general, Twisted Fate did get stronger. I mean, he stayed in the same tier, but he got stronger in general. Zyra in general as well, still very powerful. Her plants are just annoying as hell to deal with. You can just farm easily during the lane phase, keep summoning plants, keep zoning away the enemy champions, and still do a lot of damage in the late game. You still have some assassins, I should say, in the A tier. Fizz got a nice buff. I don't think the buff to Fizz really does that much, to be fair. I still think that Fizz can probably still do okay in the mid lane. You still have some outplay potential if you can use your auto attack reset to your advantage. If you can land your ultimate, then great, it works out well. If you can't, then it's a little bit of a struggle. Gragas as well here you got in the mid lane. In my opinion, Gragas is better in the jungle, but you can still make him work in the mid lane. Kennen, of course, with the buff, still stays in A tier. Was tempted to move Kennen up into S tier because Kennen's such a great teamfight champion. I just don't think the damage is there for Kennen right now. Vex as a mage is also still very good. I would say maybe one of the weaker ones in terms of the mages though, because Vex is a lot more to do with... I clicked on that instead by accident again. Vex is a lot more depending on her burst damage compared to other mages, which can do a lot more sustained damage in general. That I already spoke about. Akshan's still okay in the mid lane as well. You can still have the outplay potential. It's a lot more difficult now to bully champions though in the mid lane as Akshan, again, because every single mage in the game got HP buff, got a base armor buff, armor per level, and HP per level. So AD mid laners or AD carry mid laners are definitely much weaker. Corki, I'll talk a bit more in the AD carry role, but mid lane Corki still could be pretty okay. You can still make it work. You can still scale. Again, the problem is Manamune is pretty slow item and you're not really that useful during the early game. I'm kind of waiting for Corki's rework where his package can spawn right next to him. I think that'll be a huge buff to Corki when that eventually comes in. Annie still has a lot of burst damage with her ultimate. She can still one-shot champions if she has the opportunity to, especially with the buff to first strike. Kayle, the same with Baron lane, the same with jungle. Her early game now is a lot easier. So you can sit in mid lane, you can just sit underneath tower. Again, you're not really that useful to help your team in the early game, which you have to bear in mind, but Kayle in general can sit behind towers and just scale infinitely until level 13. Vladimir, better in the mid lane than what he is in the Baron lane. Baron lane, you just lose to a lot of bruises and you just struggle a lot against tanks, whereas in the mid lane, you can kind of use your pull to dodge some of the mage's abilities and you can farm a lot easier. Yone, again, you can use the advantage of your mobility in the laning phase to try and take small trades against mages. You can dash forward, you can use your shield on your second ability, and then you can take short trades and you can win trades early on and then scale and be a bit annoying later on. Katarina still struggles by not having, still struggles by enemy teams having crowd control. If they have any lockdown, any crowd control, it's very difficult to play Katarina, but she still has great carry potential, which is nice. Lux's buff is actually quite nice, especially for mid lane Lux. I moved Lux up from B tier to A tier. Her first ability, now dealing more damage to minions, is actually huge for a wave clear. She can wave clear a lot easier now in the mid lane. She doesn't have to really stay underneath the tower. The problem is that if you use your first ability to clear the minion waves and then you get ganked straight afterwards, you have no way to escape. You just have your shield and that's about it. Like, you have no other way to try and survive from these ganks. So you do have to be very careful when using your first ability with minions or towards minions, just in case you might get ganked. But in general, Lux is definitely stronger. And then of course Jace as well in the mid lane is also very good. I think B tier, you just have either unique champions or champions in general that are just weak. AP Malphite mid lane, if you still want to play it, go ahead. I mean, you could maybe make it work with like one-shotting someone with Malphite ultimate, which I don't think you can really do anymore. But yeah, Malphite mid lane is just pretty meh in general. Seraphine just doesn't have the damage really and just the carry potential. I think playing her as a support is just a lot easier and a lot better to play with all her healing and shielding. Same with Karma as well. Both of these are like supportive mid laners that just don't really do too much in the mid lane. You can still make them work, but they're just a lot more difficult to play than other AP mages in the mid lane. Irelia definitely again going to struggle with trying to get an advantage and dash onto champions in the early game. The strong part about Irelia in the mid lane was that she got an early game advantage with runes like Empowerment. She can get an early game advantage by landing her third ability, jumping onto mages and doing a bunch of damage. The problem now is that mages have more health, they have more armor, they're a lot more difficult to kill. Pyke still can have a lot of great roaming potential. In general, Pyke mid lane is not as strong as what it once was, but it can still work. Talon mid, again, Talon jungle just has a lot more carry potential, but Talon mid, definitely not that strong right now. Swain, I still don't like. I still don't think Swain is very strong at all. And Lucian mid lane, you can still make it work, but it's just not very powerful. I need to remove this again because I keep clicking on these damn pages. Right, AD carry. AD carry is interesting. I don't think there's any champions that deserve to be an S+ tier. I mean, you could prove me wrong. I mean, if you want to put in the comments and you think that a champion deserves to be an S+ tier as an AD carry, I'll listen. I always listen to feedback. I always listen to your guys' opinions. I always, as you can probably tell, read your comments, react to your comments, reply to your comments. So if there is a champion that you feel like deserves to be in the S+ tier in AD carry, I'm open to discuss about it. I just don't think there is right now. I really don't think there is a champion that is stronger than the rest. I don't think there are champions that are really, really OP'd compared to other ones. I definitely think there's weak AD carries, C and B tier, for example. I definitely think there are weaker AD carries, but everyone in the S tier, great AD carries to play. All depends on different scenarios. There's different scenarios for different games that you need some of these different carries. If you're against a bunch of tanks, then you can go for Vayne. Vayne is got a pretty big buff this patch. I mean, Blade Rune King get a bit of a buff with everyone getting more health. Vayne in general getting more damage because there's more tanks in the game. But again, situational. If you're against assassins, then Vayne's not going to be that strong. If you don't have an enchanter support, Vayne's going to be a bit more difficult to play. You can still make her work, but she's going to be a bit more difficult to play. But in general, Vayne got stronger from the last patch to this patch, which is why she's moved from A tier up to S tier. Kai'Sa still could be very good. I moved her back up into S tier because her on-hit build now makes her more tankier. Terminus, Wit's End, you can even go for Blade Rune King in your on-hit build as well. Terminus in general has become a lot stronger because it's making everyone much more tankier in terms of AD carries as well. So again, Kai'Sa moves back up into the S tier, but again, pretty situational. You have very weak early game until you reach your first evolve, which you need to make sure you don't come up against champions like Miss Fortune, Caitlyn, Lucian, all these early game champions that can, abuse you in the early game. Zeri, still pretty good. The only downside about Zeri is that she's still very difficult to play. Her auto attacks are still very difficult to pop off. But again, her scaling, her damage potential is still there, and she's still a great champion to play. Miss Fortune, if you have a lot of crowd control in your team and you have a lot of setup potential with your ultimate, Miss Fortune can be a great carry. You're a lane bully, you do a lot of damage in the early game, you could do a lot of damage in the late game as well with your ultimate, but again, if you're against assassins, it can be very difficult. But with a lot more bruisers in the game, with a lot more tanks in the game, champions like Miss Fortune get a huge benefit. Severe, probably one of the weakest early game champions in the game, still has a decent early game, but basically you're just a wave clear bot of Severe until you get into a stage where you have enough damage with your items, and your ultimate is one of the most impactful ultimates in the game. Varus, you still have plenty of builds that you can go with Varus. I even tried on-hit Varus, it worked pretty well, but I still think the build where you go for Essence Reaver, Riftmaker, Serrader's Grudge, that sort of build is still very powerful because you get the true damage with the Riftmaker, you get the armor penetration from Serrader's Grudge, and Essence Reaver still makes your first ability do a lot of damage. Lucian, especially paired with Nami. I mean, Lucian Nami is like S+ tier right now, but Lucian paired with Nami, very, very strong. But Lucian in general, still a very strong champion to play. Huge amount of burst damage, a great amount of mobility, and with empowerment, you could do a bunch of burst damage. And if you're against bruisers, if you're against champions that like to run towards you, you could use Xayah. Again, one of the best self-peeling AD carries in the game, with her ultimate being able to dodge so many abilities and dodge so many auto attacks, and your feathers can be used to stun and do a lot of damage during the early game. Again, she's only really good against bruisers and assassins that need to run towards you. If you're against a lot of ranged champions, then Xayah is not great. She's not good at chasing champions. She's good at peeling. She's good at running back. She's good at using her feathers to advantage. And then Caitlyn, if you need a long range marksman, and if you need range, if you're against champions that can dive onto you very quickly, if you need that sort of escape mechanic, then you go for someone like Caitlyn, which has incredible range, really good poke damage, and in general just is a great AD carry. So you can see how the different AD carries, depending on the different scenarios, can be very, very beneficial. And in my opinion, as I said, that's why none of them deserve to be in the S+ tier. And I don't think none of these, I don't think Miss Fortune's better than everyone here. I don't think Varus is better than everyone here. Lucian, Xayah, I just think all the ADCs are pretty decent. Moving on to A tier, these are champions that can still work well. I mean, Ezreal, for example, has a lot easier time with being able to scale and try and get into the mid and late game. The problem is that Ezreal is still very skill shot reliant. If you don't land your skill shots, then you're in a very difficult spot. Draven actually kind of benefited a little bit from the durability patch because he's a bit more tankier himself, so he can try and take some more early game trades. And of course, he deals one of the most early game damage. He deals one of the most early game damages in the game. He deals the most damage in the early game. So you can use that to your advantage. You can poke in the early game, do a bunch of damage, try and proc your passive. But again, downside, if you don't proc your passive and if you don't get a kill in the early game, you get outscaled by pretty much every AD carry in a tier above. Jhin can still work well. I think his movement speed definitely helps him out a lot with his, with fleet footwork and also his passive. He still can do a lot of damage. The great thing is, again, you're sometimes going to be against bruisers, which is quite nice. The only downside with Jhin, which is why he's not in the S tier, is that he struggles against tanks. He doesn't do sustained damage compared to champions like Xayah, Zeri, Kai'Sa, Vayne. He's not very strong against tanks, which is why he stays in the S tier. But in general, Jhin can still work. On hit, Ashe is actually pretty decent right now. I've been trying out a bit. Again, the only downside with Ashe is that you don't really do a lot of damage. You're more there for the setup potential with your ultimate. But if you can catch someone out with your ultimate, if you can hit like a cross map ulti, then great. It can work out very, very well. Samira, I should probably move down actually. Samira, I'm definitely moving down after this. I don't think Samira's that strong at all. Tristana, you can still make work. The problem is that they nerfed Tristana quite a bit now in the early game, and you're just very, very weak during the early game. But again, if you get hit with an enchanter, if you have an enchanter by your side, Tristana can work out very well. Yeah, the reason why I would move Samira down is that she just doesn't do a lot of damage at all. Her ultimate does barely any damage. Very, very difficult, again, to break through tanks. Very difficult to have setup potential and do a lot of damage. Jinx only really works with enchanters. If you don't have enchanters, then Jinx definitely struggles. The great thing now with Jinx is that her early game becomes much easier. You can just farm and get, the 2 or 3 items that you need to try and be that late game beast that you can be on Jinx. However, I still think you need that backup potential from a support like Lulu, like Emilio, Nami, someone like that can really pill you and help you survive some of these engages. But in general, Jinx has a better early game, but still kind of struggles unless she has an enchanter. Obviously, Neela as a melee champion just doesn't work in the bot lane and just isn't really that good. Corki buff, I don't think benefits him really that much. I need to actually try out Corki to see if he's any good, but I just don't think the buff to Corki really does that much. Again, I think the big thing is when the Corki package gets changed and his passive gets changed. I think that's where he can really shine and do very, very well. Twitch, not really that great, to be fair. I mean, you don't really do that much damage with Twitch right now. If you could go for an on-hit build, if you go for things like Blade Rune King, maybe you could do damage against tanks. And if you have an enchanter by your side, you can do a lot. But in general, just not that strong. And Kalista might be the worst champion in the game. I've tried Kalista so many times. I love playing Kalista on Wild Rift. I think the way and how Kalista feels on Wild Rift makes it so much smoother to play Kalista. The problem is, does no damage. Legit no damage at all. Kalista is supposed to be this early game bully. You're supposed to get an advantage during laning phase. They nerfed Kalista to the ground because they didn't want Kalista Baron lane to be a thing, that they basically killed Kalista in the dual lane. So yeah, Kalista kind of sucks, not gonna lie. That's why Kalista's in C tier. And honestly, again, the same with supports. I cannot think there's a few champions here that I want to talk about that could potentially move up into S+ tier, and I'll talk about them first before I talk about the rest of them. In general, I don't think there are I don't think there are supports that deserve to be in the S+ tier. Again, I think the champions in the S tier all have their separate ways of winning games. They all have their different strengths, their different weaknesses, and they can still be very good. One champion I do want to talk about at the start, though, which honestly could be S+ tier, but I'm just very wary about putting him S+ tier, is Blitzcrank. Now, Blitzcrank got a huge buff a few patches ago, which honestly, his damage output is absolutely crazy right now. And Blitzcrank is one of the best champions to play against enchanters. If you can hook these enchanters that are very, very squishy, your AD carry follows up afterwards, you could do a bunch of damage. And you have that playmaking potential in the late game with your ultimates. The downside is if you don't land your hook, then you're pretty much just a walking minion that doesn't really do too much. But his movement speed now and his second ability is a huge buff. His burst damage with his ultimate, again, is absolutely massive. Yeah, if you play against tanks, then Blitzcrank is not that good because all you're doing is hooking a Nautilus, an Ornn, an Alistar, and you're not that great. So against enchanters, Blitzcrank is S+ tier. Against tanks, Blitzcrank is probably A tier. So that's why Blitzcrank is sitting in the middle at S tier. Another champion that could be S+ tier is Lulu. I still think Lulu is very, very powerful. Probably one of the best enchanters in the game. Her in general, so this is another thing, right? Enchanter supports, tank supports got the same buffs as what mid laners got. So health, base armor, base magic resist, armor per level, MR per level. Every single support in the game got buffed in terms of tankiness. In general, this benefits Enchanter supports a lot more often because you're not going to be taking as much damage as what you did before. Lulu, again, could be, could deserve to be an S+ tier, especially against some carries. And if you're playing duo queue and if you trust your AD carry, then Lulu's one of the best champions that can buff up an AD carry. But again, she's beatable. You can beat Lulu. Again, with champions like Blitzcrank, you could play someone like Singed, like Ornn, like Pyke as well, try and go in for hooks and play aggressive during the early game. The problem is that when people play against Lulu, they just stand there AFK. They don't do anything. They just stand there AFK. They just get poked by Lulu and they just let the Lulu lane scale. You don't want to do that when you're playing against the likes of Lulu, Yuumi, or any really scaling enchanter like Soraka as well. You need to play aggressive. You need to go for these aggressive plays. You need to get a lead in the early game because if you're even against a Lulu when it comes to the mid and late game, most likely that Lulu plus the AD carry will scale, will probably be the winning factor in the later games of the fight. So you need to win the early game. You need to play aggressive, which is why, in my opinion, Lulu is still beatable, which is why Lulu doesn't sit in the S+ tier. Them two champions in general, I think, can be S+ tier. I mean, Singed as well also can still be S+ tier. I think that the nerf in general maybe did hurt Singed support more than anything because it can be interrupted now, the fling. So you have a lot more supports that can actually interrupt the fling. Like Alistar, like Pyke, like Maokai. There are champions that can actually interrupt the fling from the third ability. So Singed support may be a little bit weaker than was what it was before, but I think can still work, and I still think is a very, very strong support to play. Then three champions I think can be in S+ tier, but again, they just have weaknesses. But the other champions in S tier, again, are very, very strong champions. You have Braum, for example, one of the best protecting carries in the game. Braum's shield is very, very powerful. His ultimate is one of the biggest teamfight ultimates in the game. And if you have tanks and bruisers jumping on your AD carry, Braum is the best support that you can play to protect your AD carry. Yes, Lulu can give you the shields, the movement speed, the polymorph, but no one can protect an AD carry better than Braum with shielding, blocking all the damage, with items like Redemption and Protector's Vow getting a huge buff as well. His passive means that he can stun multiple enemy champions. Overall, just a very, very strong support. Lux can be a very, very strong carry as a support as well. Again, her first ability, dealing more damage to minions, means that you can push the wave much quicker and you can help recall, which might seem like a very slim thing, but it's actually a pretty big thing overall. Yeah, it's actually a pretty big thing overall. So that's why, in general, Lux is still strong. And also, as just an AP carry in general, Lux as a carry in the bot lane can still be very good. Ornn as a support. Honestly, Ornn is very, very strong as a support. I think a lot of people underrate how strong Ornn is as a support. You can allow your AD carries to build items throughout the whole map. You have a strong amount of crowd control. Your team fight presence is absolutely insane. Your laning phase is still very good as well, especially if champions sit near a wall. Ornn is a pretty underrated support that's going to be, I think, very, very powerful as the patch goes on. And of course, it's a tank, so he can build items like Randuin's and take no damage, for example. So yeah, still very good. Zyra, again, very similar to Lux as a carry support, is still a big nuisance to deal with and still very powerful. Nautilus and Leona, if you need any other tank supports, then Nautilus and Leona are great. They both have great engage, great lockdown potential. They're both super tanky. Leona is maybe a bit more of an all-in champion because when Leona engages, doesn't really have a way to escape. Nautilus can try and use this hook to escape and other abilities as well, but both are still pretty much very all-in champions. Janna, still very good. Again, with this bruiser / tank meta, it means that Janna has a lot more easier time at protecting the carries, using the shield. Again, then we have to remember with Janna, the shield also gives you AD. or gives AD, sorry, over to your AD carry, which is a very, very powerful stat to have. The ultimate is a very good peeling tool, same with the first ability as well. The only downside to Janna before is that she was against a lot of assassins, and Janna struggles a little bit against assassins because you have to be very reactive on your timers. Whereas now if you're against bruisers like, I don't know, Xin Zhao, Renekton, for example, it's a lot easier to peel back because them assassins don't have a second engage once they engage the first time. And that means that you can protect your AD carries pretty easily. Milio, with the increased range that you give, is still very powerful, and the ultimate being that cleanse tool is still very good. Maokai with the crowd control and the tankiness is also very powerful. Pyke as a carry support is one of the best. You can really be a big carry, especially in lower elos as Pyke support. You can be very, very powerful. Soraka, still one of the best enchanters. The silence field is the most annoying fucking skill in the game, I swear to God. There was a time I was playing Camille and I was against the Soraka. I was trying to engage onto the AD carry. Silence field just cop blocks everything. So yeah, Soraka is very, very difficult in general to play against, and also her healing is still very, very strong. Alistar's still pretty good as well, again with the tankiness and mobility with phase rush. I just look at Yuumi and I just hate her, man. The amount of times that I have gone into a game in the new rank season and people in Champion Select have said, Yuumi is open. Pick Yuumi. Is it time for Yuumi? Bans Yuumi. Yuumi is not that strong. Okay, it can be strong. Don't get me wrong. If you have a fed jungler on the enemy team and a Yuumi sits on a fed jungler, it's going to be strong. But that fed jungler is going to be strong anyway, with or without Yuumi. And her laning phase is so unbelievably garbage. It's crazy. It's the same thing as Lulu, as I was briefly mentioning. The problem is that when people play against Yuumi, they don't play aggressive during the laning phase. They don't pick these aggressive supports like Blitzcrank, like Pyke, these engaged supports like Nautilus. They just pick another enchanter support like, I don't know, Milio or Janna, and they're just like, okay, we just hope we scale better than them, which might not be the case. You know, Yuumi in general, I mean, like I said, Yuumi has the weakest laning phase. I would yap on so much about Yuumi with how many people say that Yuumi is OP and Yuumi needs to be picked or banned every game. I've had enough. Yuumi is really not that strong. It's only really strong maybe if you play duo queue or trio queue with like a jungler and Yuumi just sits on a jungler for the rest of the late game and gives her base stats. But Yuumi in the laning phase, so weak. You're very, very weak and you can easily lose laning phase. Senna, actually, if you're playing this tank build, the Grasping Undying buff is actually really, really nice. I need to change the Senna build though, because I feel like Heartsteel in general is just too slow. So you probably just go Iceborne Gauntlet into like Black Cleaver, for example. But the Grasping Undying buff is very, very good for Senna. It means that she can still do damage with the health that she's building in her kit. And also she just does, she's a bit more tankier as well with her build. Nami in general, really good with Lucian. Other than that, isn't really good with any other carries, so that's why it's sitting in the A tier. Thresh is probably one of the weakest in terms of tank supports. It's just a lot harder to make Thresh work compared to someone like Leona that has a long range ultimate that has an AoE stun. Nautilus has a point and click ultimate. Blitzcrank has a hook that pulls that champion towards your team. Maokai has a huge AoE ultimate. Alistar is a very basic headbutt pulverize combo. Thresh, you either have to walk very, very close range to try and land your flay and then land your hook afterwards. Thresh is like a weaker version of Blitzcrank, I feel like right now. If you miss your hook with Thresh, you're pretty useless. The ultimate honestly doesn't do too much. The flay doesn't do too much either. You can try and pull for your support, but the hook is just much weaker on Thresh than what it is on Blitzcrank right now. And also Blitzcrank just does a lot more damage in general. Sona might be pretty good this patch. I've kept her in the SA tier for now because I still need to play her and I still need to give her a try. But I think with everyone getting the durability patch, with everyone being much more tanky, it means that Sona can survive a lot more during the laning phase and scale, get a few items, be very annoying. And Sona in the mid and late game can be one of the best enchanters because AoE slows, shielding, AoE healing, AoE movement speed, bonus damage to your team, and also the ultimate is very powerful as well in team fights. Rakan can still work whether you go for the AP build or the other build, the tank build. Rakan can still work, just isn't as strong as the other tanks or the other AP champions or carry champions at the moment. Again, very good with Xayah Rakan, for example. And Seraphine and Karma can work. Seraphine, I think, goes back to her healing and shielding build because there's so much healing and shielding percentage now that you get with your items. So I think it goes towards that. And Karma, you can just build carry if you want to and still build a lot of damage. But in general, Karma doesn't really do that much damage. And then B tier are just other champions that I just don't think work. I think Morgana in general has a bit more value this patch as a support, with the Black Shield being much more powerful. But in general, the other supports are just not that great. I mean, Swain I just don't think works as a support in general. There's no way for you to pill for your AD carries. Yes, you could be a tank, but that's about it. Galio just isn't as strong as a tank right now. Much better as an AP champion, and if you're playing an AP champion in bot lane, it's better to play some other champions. And Brand as well just doesn't really work as a support. That is everything. That is every single champion we have gone through for patch 6.0. Again, in general, this is more of a prediction more than anything with the tier list, trying to go through, trying to predict what's going to happen with the champions. As you can tell, when I go through the champions, I'm already thinking in my head of what champions can go up and can go down tiers, depending on how the meta shifts and how the meta looks when new patches come around. But hopefully you enjoyed this longer version of the tier list. I like to do this longer version of the tier list because I think it's very important to give an overview on all the champions, especially when there's a huge patch with the durability patch like 6.0. But as always, if you enjoyed the content, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure you tune into my live stream later on today, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.